So hello, my name is Lisa Worm. I'm with Fair Districts Ohio. I just want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. I know this is our second event for today, actually numerous events, but thank you to everyone who attended Fair Maps Day down at the State House. Even the rain couldn't keep us out. But I think there was a lot of really interesting feedback we're getting from legislators on just how they're feeling. So I think it'll really be worthwhile. So I didn't get to put up my 20-foot duck, but I think I'll be okay. So welcome tonight. The event title is Ohio Voted to End Gerrymandering. Let's get to work. And tonight we'll focus on Southwest Ohio. So first I want to thank those joining us tonight as panelists. So including Fair Districts Ohio, as I said, Common Cause Ohio, ACLU of Ohio, and we also have NAACP, the Ohio Conference. I apologize, Tom, if I misspoke about that. And then as well as University of Cincinnati, Dr. Niven will be joining us, and the Cincinnati Enquirer. So, and from the Cincinnati Enquirer, tonight is our moderator, will be Jessie Balmert. So Jessie, she has covered state government and politics for the Cincinnati Enquirer for the past 6 years. I definitely know her face around the State House. So she now works on a team of reporters called the USA Today Network Ohio Bureau, and that includes the Columbus Dispatch, the Akron Beaker Journal, and the Canton Repository. Jessie is an Ohio native and went to Ohio University's Scripps School of Journalism. So she lives in Columbus with her cat, Zoe, who will probably be making an appearance tonight, but we welcome all people and animals tonight. So take it away, Jessie.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, I joked earlier that my cat thinks that she is a Zoom star, so I anticipate she will be making an appearance at some point this afternoon. So we have a great group of panelists, and I think you'd probably rather hear from them than from me, but I thought I'd give us a quick update of what's happened in the past week, which has been a lot. So the first test of the voter-approved changes to the Ohio Constitution was for many people a disappointing and disheartening one. The 7-member Ohio Redistricting Commission approved a 4-year map along party lines early Thursday. This map, according to Senate President Matt Huffman, would give Republicans a supermajority in the Ohio House, somewhere between a 62-37 and 64-35 advantage, and a 23-10 advantage in the Ohio Senate. In a letter justifying the maps, the Republicans wrote that the statewide preferences of the voters of Ohio predominantly favor Republican candidates. And that preference was anywhere from 54%, which is the average votes received by GOP candidates in statewide races, all the way up to 81%, which was 13 of 16 statewide races won over the past decade by Republican candidates. Democrats in their minority report wrote that the district maps adopted by Republicans today in no way reflect the statewide preferences of voters in Ohio and do not closely correspond to the statewide election results of the past 10 years. A lawsuit is expected as soon as this week. The Ohio Supreme Court has sole jurisdiction over reviewing maps for partisan gerrymandering, and the Ohio Supreme Court has 4 Republicans and 3 Democrats. Chief Justice Maureen O'Connor, who is a Republican, is considered the swing vote in any sort of decisions. That's partially because of her past kind of judicial decisions, but also she is not able to run again because of age limits. So this is her last term. Challenges to the Voting Rights Act could be heard in federal court. So Ohio Supreme Court, based off these constitutional changes, will first look at splits and population before considering what we've heard a lot about, representational fairness, or whether a map favors one party over the other. The language in Section 6 is shall attempt, which some lawmakers, Republicans, have taken as aspirational, while others question how much the majority party aspired to those goals. I guess switching gears, the first congressional redistricting deadline is September 30th, and Senate President Matt Huffman has already said they will likely miss that. They miss that deadline, it kicks it back to the Ohio Redistricting Commission, which has until October 31st to pass a 10-year map with 4 total votes, including the 2 Democratic members. If not, it heads back to the Ohio legislature, which can pass either a 10-year map with 60% and 1/3 of Democrats, or a 4-year map with just the majority. And that all has to be done by November 30th. So there's a lot we're still going to be following over the next several months, but I will get to our panelist here. So our first panelist is Professor David Niven. He teaches American politics at the University of Cincinnati, conducts research on campaigns, political communications, and death penalty policy. David is author of several books, including The Politics of Injustice, The Kennedys, The Freedom Rides, and the Electoral Consequences of a Moral Compromise, and has published research in numerous journals. David was an expert witness in the A. Philip Randolph Institute versus Larry Householder, a case challenging Ohio's congressional districts as an unconstitutional gerrymander. He has a PhD from The Ohio State University, whose football team is looking a little shaky right now. So over to David.
Thank you, Jessie, and I appreciate this opportunity to talk a little bit about where we are and the maps that have been proposed. You know, obviously, a lot of folks across this state and millions of voters invested themselves in a reform of the redistricting process, and in this exact moment can rightly feel let down, rightly feel betrayed, perhaps. Part of the bottom line, and this is much bigger than just redistricting or just Ohio, is a process is only as good as its people. And it mattered, the 7 members of the Ohio Redistricting Commission, who those people were and what their commitment to the process was. You know, Jessie alluded to the fact that the Republicans referred to the Constitution as aspirational, you know, which is an interesting mindset, an interesting mentality, that you can pursue this if you feel like it. But, you know, don't get carried away. You know, obviously in this moment in American politics, people realize, perhaps to an unfortunate degree, the fragility of our system and the fragility of our processes. And, you know, most famously, there was an impeachment of Andrew Johnson that took place after the Civil War, in which our system of government was really put to the test, because the grounds for impeachment were really trumped up. They were really based on a desire for political overthrow. And Johnson survived that, and the system survived. But understand this, the margin was 1 vote. Literally, the margin was 1 vote. They were 1 vote away from removing the president and having something of a political coup. And in Ohio, our question is, who's going to be Edmund Ross? Who's going to be the person who stands up and says, this is what's right, and this is what we should do, rather than this is what's easy to do? And we found out last week that it wasn't going to be Mike DeWine, and it wasn't going to be Frank LaRose. They had their moment to stand up for a fair map, and they chose not to. And, you know, many of you remember the famous quotes from Martin Luther King about, you know, who was the greatest stumbling block to freedom? And King famously said in a letter from the Birmingham jail that it wasn't, you know, it wasn't the KKK, or it was the moderate who valued order over justice. And we got a dose of that last week. Now, let's talk about the maps in Southwest Ohio, and let's put a little specifics to this. Let's see if I can work the magic internet here. All right, and here we go. Okay, so let's talk about Southwest Ohio here for a minute and put some things into perspective. So in Hamilton County, just put a little baseline to it, the county voted for Biden over Trump by a margin of 16%. So you'd expect legislative districts that reflect that reality. This is a solid blue county. Now let's take a look at the state Senate districts. This is the map that was approved by the Redistricting Commission. And Hamilton County, despite voting strongly for Democratic candidates, winds up a part of 2 Republican districts and 1 Democratic district. You say, well, that doesn't necessarily strike us immediately as totally fair. How do they do that? How do they turn a Democratic county into a Republican outcome? Let me give you a couple of ways. They cram literally people into the Democratic districts. The population of District 9 in the middle of your screen there in light blue is 29,325 people more than the Republican leaning district that you see in purple, District 8. And, when you talk about vote dilution, this is as simple as it gets. Cram Democrats together. Those people, 29,000 more, it takes 29,000 more people to have a Democratic district than it does to have a Republican district in Hamilton County. That's the essence of the task. How do we find ways just at the edge of what we think we can get away with that tilts these numbers in the favor of the folks who drew the map? Let me give you another fact here. I don't want to get overly jargon filled here, but there's a concept called the efficiency gap. And in simplest terms, it's how many votes are we wasting of a party relative to how many votes are we wasting for the other party. So wasted votes are votes cast for losing candidates. Wasted votes are votes cast beyond what it would take to win the election. So if you cram all the Democrats into one district, you're giving them way more votes than they need to win in that one district, so that you reduce their potency in surrounding districts. Look at this number, 42%. In effect, Democratic votes in Hamilton County are at a 42% discount rate. They have 42% less effect on election outcomes. That is an astonishing number. Just to understand how this map was drawn and to whom it was drawn, statewide, the efficiency gap's about 11%. So statewide, Democratic votes are worth about 11% less than Republican votes. How do they get there? They get there by targeting places like Hamilton County with an overwhelming gap, with a obviously Herculean effort to take a Democratic place and turn it into a Republican outcome. Let's look at Montgomery County. Here's a nice competitive county, lean Democratic in 2020. Well, you would think Montgomery County, if it's going to be close to even, it would get close to even representation. And here's the map they drew. Montgomery County gets 1 Republican district, and the other district is perfectly competitive. Again, you would think in a competitive county, you could get competitive Senate districts, and instead you get part of the county represented in a very strongly Republican district and part of the county in a perfectly even district. So, this is how you get the statewide outcomes. You target the places where Democrats are, and you reduce the potency of their vote. And the efficiency gap number in Montgomery County, again, off the charts, 23%. So the value of a Democratic vote is at a discount of 23% in Montgomery County, 42% in Hamilton County. And this is the nature of the map, and this is sort of fundamental to its outcome. Where do we get the statewide trends? Where do we get overrepresentation of Republicans? How do we turn 54% of the vote into 2/3 of the seats? Well, you do it just like I showed you, by drawing Hamilton County and Montgomery County and many other places across Ohio in a way that is unnatural and in a way that is diluting the value of a Democratic vote. I testified a couple times before the Ohio Redistricting Commission, and I was struck, by a give and take with some of the members. The state auditor, Keith Faber, said to me, well, Republicans win 8 out of 10 statewide races, shouldn't they get 8 out of 10 districts? And just pause for a moment and think about a person who's won his office. What kind of monumental, great percentage of the vote do you think Keith Faber won to get the auditor's job? It was 49.7%. 49.7%. He's asserting that win at 49.7% contributes to and entitles Republicans to 4/5 of all the seats in the legislature. That's the mentality that contributed to the drawing of the maps. So my sort of lesson for folks, my message for folks is these are maps that are both extraordinary and perfectly mundane. They're perfectly mundane, and it's exactly what we saw 10 years ago. What's extraordinary is we have a new set of rules in place. We have a new set of standards in place. And the Ohio Redistricting Commission acted as if none of that ever happened. And that's not aspirational, that's delusional. And the good news is this process is not over. This is not the final step. And there is still a fight left to be had. So I appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts with everybody tonight, and I look forward to hearing from our other panelists.
Thanks, David. For everyone who's listening, we're going to hear from each of the panelists, and then we're going to have a Q&A session at the end. So I'm going to introduce our next panelist, who is Tom Roberts. He's recently been elected president of the NAACP for the state of Ohio, formerly led the NAACP Ohio Conference, and has long been a member of the NAACP Dayton. Tom was formerly an Ohio State Senator and Representative, where he served the people of the Miami Valley for more than 20 years. And Tom was born in Montgomery County, where he has resided ever since. So I'll hear from you, Tom.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and I appreciate the work that Dr. Niven has done. His testimony was outstanding. It laid out the foundation by which the maps should have been drawn. And unfortunately, and I have to read the dictionary and what shall means. I thought shall meant shall. I guess they have a different dictionary. I came together with A. Philip Randolph, Ohio Organizing Collaborative, and NAACP. We put together in early April or May the Citizens Commission on Redistricting. We looked at the work that groups like Ohio Voices, Common Cause, ACLU put together in talking about drawing fair districts. And we took that to heart. The Constitution is the Constitution. I don't know what they're reading, but the Constitution laid out the foundation by which the maps should be drawn. And we put together a 16-member commission made up of academia, former legislators, a civil rights group, and sociologists to look at maps. We had probably 7 virtual hearings and 5 working groups. So we had a total of 12 gatherings where we either heard public testimony or we brought people together to talk about what the maps should look like. But I will tell you this, we heard from over 500 citizens virtually from across the state saying, here's the way they thought the maps should be done. We began in May. And the point of what I'm saying to you is that the legislature could have done the same thing. They chose not to. They were lazy. They could have began in May to start hearing from the people. And then when the census data come together, put that piece together, but we did it. And our maps totally reflect, as Dr. Nevins pointed out, what's going on in Ohio. We looked at, I think it was 3 statewide races, presidential and 2 gubernatorials. And what we discovered is in the last decade, Republicans have won 54% of the statewide races. 54%, almost what he was talking about with the Auditor Faber. But yet they control 75%, a super majority of the legislative districts. Being a former legislator, the House seat that's being destroyed was the seat that I represented, the House that I represented. And it was totally in Montgomery County. Taking it out of Montgomery County is a way of gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is drawing the lines to favor one party over the other. and it's not fair, it's not right, and it's not following the Constitution. You know what gerrymandering does? It creates districts with predictable outcomes. The predictable outcomes clearly creates unresponsive elected officials and makes the primary the real race in the election, where the people don't have a choice in the November election. It's bad for government. It's dysfunctional. We see this happening so many times in what's going on in Columbus and what's going on in Washington. And that's why the people said, enough is enough. Let's draw fair districts. The legislature is not listening. And that's why whatever happens next, I'm sure it's going to be a legal issue, but it's unfortunate that the citizens once again are going to have to pay for the irresponsible decisions made by members of the General Assembly. I'm simply discouraged by what's happened. I hope that when it comes to drawing the congressional maps, there's a little less partisanism and more of what the people wanted, but I'm not going to be shocked if it's not. You know, when I served in the legislature, and I'll end with this, it was pretty much, I think where there were 60 Democrats and the rest Republicans, but they weren't all, at any given time, they weren't all Democrats who were with Speaker Rife, or all Republicans weren't with Joanne Davidson. She had a group, the Republicans had a group called the Caveman Caucus, and they released 10 or 12, and they were proud of this title. This is not my title, this is their title. They were proud of it, but she couldn't get them to agree. And when Speaker Davidson couldn't get them to agree on issues that she wanted done, she came to the Democrats to get support. That's what it should be like. If your party can't get it done, then let's go across the aisle and have some bipartisan supporting legislation. Right now, the supermajority doesn't require that, call for that, and so they can do whatever they want. The people need to get back to, as Speaker Rife would often say, the people's house. It's no longer the people's house. It's gerrymandered at its best. I look forward to the questions.
Thanks, Tom. We're going to go to our last panelist, Catherine Turcer. She's the Executive Director of Common Cause Ohio and co-leader of the Fair Districts Ohio Coalition Campaign, an expert on redistricting reform and state-level campaign finance. She answers a lot of my questions. Catherine advocates for greater transparency and more accountable government. Before joining Common Cause in April of 2012, Catherine was Ohio Citizen Action's Legislative Director. You're up.
Well, thank you so much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, which always takes a little longer than you actually expect. Hang on, everybody. So I thought that, we should start just, with a sense of the things that have been happening all over the state. That during these hearings that the Ohio Redistricting Commission had, so they had field hearings and they had hearings following the proposed maps that came out on the 9th of September. And people came out all over the state. They made many really impassioned, what we can best call pleas for better transparency, for maps that kept their communities together, and for maps that actually reflected them. And there were real specific details. And then there was just the general unhappiness with the manipulation of districts. But no matter what I really heard from the folks that came out to testify is that they really care about voting. They want to participate in meaningful elections. We want to actually have a functioning democracy. And so, when we start to think about what happens with these congressional district lines, I think it's really important for us to think about, where we started, and how we've had fewer congressional districts, but that also the precision of the gerrymandering, the precision of the manipulation of those districts has gotten more and more intense over the years. And that's because, in 1991, when they were drawing these district lines, they basically had a gymnasium. They laid it out on a piece of paper and they were creating these districts on a piece of paper with pencils and trying to figure out how to move districts around. And now, any of us can draw a district, and the democratization of map making is good because we can actually push back. We can have a conversation. Hey, you made this map? Well, here, let's improve it this way. You can have a conversation. But it's also really important to remember that we wouldn't have, the snake on the lake, that district that goes, from Toledo to Cleveland, if we didn't have the ability to really precisely gerrymander or manipulate district lines to manipulate elections. And, many of us will think about the Duck District and other districts that are right at home. We start to think about, well, what about, I'm going to throw out Hamilton County in this case. I picked Congressional District 1, so you were talking Steve Shabat's district. And one of the things that struck me as funny is that, you can go to a Xavier basketball game and you can attend the basketball game in Congressional District 1. And then you can work your way over to Congressional District 2 to park your car. Now, but sometimes you hate to say that you enjoy some of the manipulation, but clearly the map makers enjoyed some of the manipulation. And I think it's really important to think about what happened with Congressional District 1. Now, most of us aren't necessarily thinking about 10 years ago, but 10 years ago, Steve Driehaus was the congressman when the maps were, manipulated. And let's look at what happened to the cracking of Hamilton County. Then we got another Steve. We got Steve Shabat. And it has been a Republican district ever since. And so one of the things that has been the most challenging about the gerrymander of 2011 is how permeable it was. It just continued and continued and continued. And it didn't matter if there was movement and population grew in Central Ohio, but it changed completely in some areas and just was the same in others. It just didn't matter. We sent 12 Republicans to DC and we sent 4 Democrats to DC. And when you look at this is just a really good example of cracking, where you take, a section of Hamilton County, which is more Democratic, and you surround it by Warren County. You can surround it by some Republican area where you're actually diluting the vote. And I think it's important for us to think about, well, why is it we want to keep communities together? One is you want to send somebody to represent you, but also you don't want to have your community divided or manipulated in a way that will actually take away the ability to represent someone that you would want, that to make it so that your vote wouldn't be meaningful. I included also this is the one that's on the bottom left. Basically, there was a house that was cut out of, this is North Bend Road. So this is kind of intersects College Hill. Anyway, it was just the whole notion that when they were doing the precision of the 2011 map making, they were doing this so very, very precisely. And so as we're going into this congressional map making, we need to be thinking about, well, what's possible with the tools that they have at their disposal and what's reining them in. And we know, folks from all over the state were testifying about the challenge of gerrymandering and how, what we want is to participate in, a representational democracy that works. We don't want unfair and undemocratic district lines that manipulate our vote. And as Professor Niven was talking about that whole process, I was at the one in Cleveland, this is Warrensville Heights. And one of the things that was so clear to me is people were really begging to be taken seriously and to be heard, and that they wanted their vote to count. And it was genuinely painful just after midnight on September 15th, so early in the morning on the 16th, when we got district lines for the State House that were not reflective of the rules that are in the Ohio Constitution. And I've always been, just a really big fan of, hey, if there are no rules, well, of course they're going to get up to nonsense. Of course they're going to not necessarily make the best choices. of course they're going to gerrymander. It's very hard to put away that political tool. It made sense to me that if in fact you had good rules, like cats should not get into a fight, if you had good rules that in fact that people would live up to that. And I was so hopeful that the members of the Ohio Redistricting Commission would actually live up to the good rules. I did want to highlight that there are, rules that for congressional map making that really focus on keeping counties whole. And, yes, there's some rules, you can divide this and you can divide that. I think what's important for us is to keep in mind that the majority of counties must be kept whole. Some can be split. And also to remember that why do we actually go through this whole process of dividing in the first place? Well, it's because the districts should be fairly equal in population. And so there are sometimes that it's going to be necessary to make, divisions. I think what is interesting is Cincinnati may not be split. And then I think, as we're thinking about all of the map making, we cannot forget the Voting Rights Act. We cannot forget that we need to make sure that there are opportunity districts, and those are districts where there's the opportunity of electing, for example, an African-American area, an African-American representative. And that we need to be mindful of, what it is that those communities want. And so as we go through and we think about, okay, well, there are going to be 15 districts, it, probably is not going to be that hard to use the building blocks of the counties to create some really good districts if there is the will to do this. And one of the things I wanted to highlight as we were thinking about, well, what's in the Ohio Constitution for Congress? So we have a deadline of September 30th that is in the Ohio Constitution. Okay, well, there's no way they are going to meet a deadline of September 30th. They haven't had any committee hearings. They haven't introduced any maps. They haven't held any public hearings. It is genuinely not possible at this point to actually meet that deadline unless they so limit public deliberation that you're not going to get to the point where you're going to get a good bipartisan map. It's just not possible. And one of the things that was really interesting today, we had this Fair Maps Day, and folks, hopefully some of you that are on this participated in that. They went and they talked to legislators and they talked to aides. And one of the things that struck me is how often, a fair district person would come back and they'd say, well, the aide didn't really know anything. They hadn't been given any information. They had no idea what was happening. They didn't even know there was a deadline of September 30th. So I think we can assume that what's going to happen is that the map making is going to go to the Ohio Redistricting Commission. Now, in the Ohio Constitution, they established kind of a series of steps. And it was that idea of like, oh my goodness, it is incredibly difficult to get to bipartisan map making. And so we should look at this as like a gauntlet. Okay, so they're going through this, and they're, the first time, they try to get kind of super majority of members plus 50% of Democrats and Republicans. Okay, this is super high level, and that type of consensus is really hard to get at. Well, then you send it to the Ohio Redistricting Commission. In this case, they need 4 members. At minimum, 2 have to be, Democrats, 2 have to be Republicans. The way it is in the Ohio Constitution is majority minority party, or the 2 major parties. But the way to understand this is that to pass a map, a congressional map, the Ohio Redistricting Commission is not going to be able to do a 4-year map. What they'll be doing is trying to figure out how to get 2 members that are Democrats, 2 members that are Republican to approve a map. And that deadline is at the end of October. I love Halloween. Do y'all love Halloween? It's interesting to think about how scary gerrymandering is. Okay, so let's say that doesn't work. In November, the congressional map making goes back to the state legislature. Now, state legislature has not taken the steps that are necessary to do a thoughtful process. And there are 2 different options at this point. One, they can pass with 60% of the members. So kind of, more than 50%, 60%. And then 1/3 of the Democrats, 1/3 of the Republicans are necessary. Or they can pass a 4-year map. In this case, what happens is the 4-year map has additional requirements. And I always think that's really important, that these additional requirements include, as opposed to just having to keep counties together, it goes counties, cities, townships. So you can't manipulate as much, as you can with just focusing on counties. It reins in things. Then there's a real focus on, you can't draw district lines to favor or disfavor a political party or a candidate. So think about incumbents. You can't be drawing it to favor incumbents. And then there's an explanation that has to be in writing. Now, if in fact there is a commitment to the rules, this 4-year map becomes more complicated because the rules become tighter. And so that's, that is really what that's what could happen. The rules could constrain bad behavior. The rules could encourage bipartisan map making. This is an experiment. One of the things that is exciting is that Ohio, like some other states, are trying new things this redistricting cycle. And we're learning, well, sometimes the rules do not actually rein in the bad behavior. I am always hopeful. I don't think you can actually spend, a couple decades focusing on improving democracy without being hopeful, but it becomes difficult knowing what happened with the Ohio Redistricting Commission last week. And with that, I am going to hand it back to my friend Jessie for questions and guiding us along.
Great, thank you. So we've had a lot of questions in the chat, so I'm going to just get right to them. And as a person who's been on the other side of a panel, I find it helpful to just direct it to one person, but then anyone else can pop in and answer. So I'm going to give the first tough question to Catherine about the lawsuits and/or court process. So some of the questions are, who might file a lawsuit? How many people might file a lawsuit? If there are multiple lawsuits, who decides what the Supreme Court handles? And also what might the Supreme Court be looking at?
Well, I have to tell you, early in the morning on the 16th, I was getting back, from the State House. And, between 1 and 2, I wanted to make them pay. That notion of how is it that they didn't read the Constitution? How is it that they didn't deliberate in public? How did we get here? And really, the decision to move forward with lawsuits is a process. There's a process of weighing exactly what happened, when it happened, and to identify the best approach. Now, what that will be, I do not know. I'm a social worker, so I'm actually not part of the legal team. What I will tell you is that there are folks that are identifying the challenges and the best approaches to get us fairer maps. Now, how that will work, I do not know. It is incredibly challenging to wait. I want answers now, and I may not be quite as, bloodthirsty as I was, early in the morning on last Thursday, but I'm still really angry. And so I also would like to know exactly what's happening with the lawsuits. I think, give it a little while. It won't be long. And the reason it won't be long, if in fact lawsuits are going to be filed, and I think we can assume that they will be, if they're going to be filed, then what we do know is they're going to want to do this quickly. And they're going to want to do it quickly because in 2022, we're going to have some elections. They're going to want to actually litigate this as quickly as they can so that we have good district lines in place in 2022.
Thanks. I do think just studying the Ohio Constitution, as I have the past couple of weeks, it's important to note that the Ohio Supreme Court can't draw the maps. So they might kick them back to the Ohio Redistricting Commission with some guidelines. So that'll be interesting how that works out. Questions about congressional redistricting, either for David or Tom. What could District 1 and 2 in Cincinnati look like? As we've mentioned, Cincinnati has to be kept into one congressional district. Could you still draw 2 GOP seats in Hamilton County and keep Cincinnati together?
Well, that is a real question of, can you follow the precise letter of the law while totally defying the spirit of it? I think that the short answer is simply keeping Cincinnati together is transformative in and of itself. That by getting rid of the zigzag lines that cut through 14 different Cincinnati neighborhoods, by getting rid of, as Catherine referenced earlier, some of the lunacy of the lines that cut off the Xavier basketball arena from the Xavier basketball arena parking, or more specifically, cut through neighborhoods like Oak Knoll Drive, where your next door neighbor's in a different district, and you go 2 doors down, they're back in your district. And there's a house on Oak Knoll where the living room and the bedroom are in different districts. So just fixing that is transformative. I think the short answer is they'll likely wind up, in effect, conceding Cincinnati and a chunk of Hamilton County to a Democratic district, just to make their lives easier with the rest of the work that has to be done. But it's true, there's still room for some chicanery. But again, you get back to, where are the votes coming from the other party for a map? If you set out diabolically to keep Cincinnati intact and still somehow make that a Republican district, there's not a single Democratic vote for that in the legislature or on the redistricting commission.
Thanks.
I actually have a few districts, a few maps, if folks want to look at some. Do you want to look at some? Okay, hang on.
You can pull them up quickly.
All right, here we go. So I just want, the reason I was giving, sorry about that, we're trying to hit present. One of the things that I think, when I talked about the democratization of district lines, is that now any of us could actually use a variety of different free software to create district lines that better reflect community and focus on keeping counties whole. And so these are just some of the districts, district maps that have been created on Dave's districting app. And I just was really interested in, there are all sorts of different ways that you can create districts. No map is completely perfect. And what we want is an opportunity for folks to comment on them, make recommendations on them, and for the commissioners to actually deliberate about them. And with that, I will stop sharing.
The only thing I would say is that we have to look at the maps from a national perspective. There are 435, I think, roughly equal districts that have to be drawn. Ohio will lose 1 seat. So the first question is where that will be. Now, we all think it may be Mahoney Valley or Tim Ryan's area that might be the site. We don't know, but we do know we have a congressional district going from Cleveland to Akron, Cleveland to Summit County. We know we have a congressional district going from Urbana to Lorain, going through many, many different counties to work its way up there. We do know we have a legislative district going from Toledo to Cleveland. At least clean up those nightmares for those voters. That's what's the first thing. We're going to lose a seat. We know that, and that's because other states have picked up population. But whatever the maps do, again, they should be fair, and they should roughly have the same or equal amount of people, give or take a percentage in different directions in each one of those districts.
Great, thank you. For Tom, Ray DeRossi said that he was directed by legislative leaders not to consider racial or demographic data when drawing the maps. And, we've had court cases indicate race can be considered, but when it's not the only factor. How should the Voting Rights Act be abided by, considered, especially looking forward at these congressional maps?
It's unfortunate that over the years they've used the Voting Rights Act against drawing the districts. But let's be clear, cracking and packing is in violation. And so we need to make sure that doesn't happen. We should take in consideration the Constitution. And there are precedented cases, state law or federal law, that gives them direction how to draw those districts. So my advice to Ray, DeRossi, and others would be to follow the courts, follow what the courts say, follow what the voting rights say, and draw districts that are not packing and cracking and diluting the voices of African Americans. That's a critical piece. You know, the voices are diluted when you draw districts that are not representational.
Thanks. For David or Catherine, last time we went through this process, Speaker John Boehner loomed large over it. There isn't necessarily the current Speaker of the House involved in the process this time, but what sort of national groups or members of Congress will be weighing in on the congressional district process?
Catherine, you want to start?
So it is true, Team Boehner looked over all those district lines, and I think many of us will remember, you know, the emails from the bunker. And, you know, Heather Mann Blessing is still very involved, you know, as we watch the Ohio Redistricting Commission convene. She was there in the back. You know, when I think about, you know, Team Boehner, I often think about the Timken Peninsula, that adding that district to what would have been Jim Renace's district, so a donor would be in his district at the very last minute. So are things going to be different this time? Well, of course, you know, the strong hand of John Boehner is not going to be there. It's not completely clear who the leader will be from either congressional delegation. I think what we do know is that all members of Congress are going to be looking very closely at what's happening to their districts. And so it's very likely that they'll weigh in. There are a number of Republican and Democrat groups that are interested in the map making. You know, many of us will remember Project Red Map that was around in 2011. They still are. And many of us will be very aware that Eric Holder is paying very close attention to like what is actually happening with the maps. And with that, I'll hand it to David, who has a kind of a slightly different perspective.
You know, I would just add, we don't have a Boehner, we don't have, you know, an adult in the room who has some larger vision for what they want here. And one of the fundamental realities, you know, is there's a lot of territory, you know, there's a lot of different ways to draw a Jim Jordan district, for example. So, you know, some of the folks out there are hoping that the congressional delegation will be transformed. You know, there are limits. There are limits to how much it can be. Now, can a fairer map come out of this? Absolutely. And it's easy to draw a fair map. It takes a lot of effort to draw a 75% Republican map. That's the kind of thing that keeps you staying up all night and, you know, keeps the consultants paid into the stratosphere. You know, I think, you know, Catherine is certainly right. There are Democratic and Republican groups who care deeply because of the bottom line. We have a House that is almost evenly divided. So every potential seat that moves from one column to the other or moves into the competitive column matters. But, you know, let's remember that the bottom line here, in the last decade, our map was undefeated. 80 elections, and 80 elections all kept the seat in the same party's hand. And that, I do believe, is going to come to an end on the basis of those rules, on the basis of not being able to keep Cincinnati divided and Cleveland divided. I think, you know, whether outside pressure groups intercede or not, those things can be counted on to change.
Great, thanks. Tom, having worked with the Ohio Citizens Redistricting Commission, are all citizens advocacy groups in agreement about what these maps should look like? It appeared OCRC's maps were a little bit different from like the winners of the fair districts, Ohio. How does that work?
Well, our map followed the Constitution and followed all the guidelines. Early on, we had an understanding that what we were going to do may be different than some others, you know, and we're just going to support the maps that we drawn. If we are asked, the Citizens Commission Redistricting, we follow all the guidelines, we follow the Constitution. And so our map was the best map put forward. But we're not going to criticize other maps because we think they all follow the guidelines. They just saw some districts, they saw some numbers in a different way that our map drawers, based on what we shared with them, saw it the way we wanted it to come out.
This is kind of a technical question, but is there a requirement that Hamilton, Franklin, and Cuyahoga counties be completely contained in one district? Like, how much do counties need to be kept in the same district?
Well, they're too big to be in a congressional district. So the bottom line, you know, for these counties is somebody has to be drawn out of the largest congressional district in the county. What's transformative, though, and you know, population is population, and Republicans, you know, are going to have to adhere to that. But what's transformative would be places like Summit County and Akron, where that's a county that can fit by population size into a congressional district that in our current map is split into 4 different congressional districts. That is no longer you know, acceptable or constitutional. You know, for the folks in Hamilton County, you know, the logical approach would be to make a congressional district entirely in Hamilton County, and then, you know, the folks who are, you know, population that's too big for that would be paired off with surrounding counties.
Great, thanks. And I know the city of Columbus is too large for even one
Right.
congressional district, so it's going to have to be divided in some way that these various people will figure out. Is representational fairness, this kind of section 6 that we've been discussing so much, a part of the congressional district requirements? Maybe Catherine.
So no, and it's interesting because we will remember that when representational fairness was added in 2014, this was, you know, the state legislature was having these late night conversations about, you know, should there be representational fairness? And political scientist, Professor Emeritus Dick Gunther laid out the notion that there should be representational fairness. In other words, you look at, you know, statewide elections for 10 years, and you come up with, hey, how many Democratic votes, how many Republican votes? And it's a way to understand how gerrymandered maps are. And so, you know, if you're 54% Republican, you know, 54% of the districts should kind of lean towards the Republicans, and 46% should lean towards Democrats. Hopefully there are some in there that are more competitive, but it provides that kind of formula of representational fairness should provide a way to identify gerrymandering. Well, as we know, our Ohio Redistricting Commission played around with it and said that, hey, the districts could be as high as 81% Republican. So clearly the legislative intent was lost. Keep in mind that Senate President Matt Huffman was the sponsor of the legislation, and he understood what was decided during 2014 and what went to the voters in 2015. Now in 2018, this was a no-go. This was not something that was on the table for congressional districts because they considered this to be problematic, and there was no way they were going to do it. They considered it so bad that we couldn't even start a conversation about a legislative attempt for moving congressional redistricting reform as long as representational fairness was on the table. Clearly, they hadn't figured out how to do very fuzzy math at that point. They considered it to be a real problem for them, and it's not included in the congressional redistricting that is in the Ohio Constitution.
Thanks. I'm not sure if either David or Tom has done more kind of digging into the maps that were passed on Thursday, but can you say whether the maps approved by the commission do have splits in counties and cities and municipalities? Like, how well did they follow the non-Section 6 requirements?
I'll let Dr. Niven answer most of it, but I'm looking at the one particularly here in Montgomery County. the area that I represented for almost 14 years, the Trotwood area. They took that map and took it into Preble County. And that actually forced the Democrats to lose the Senate seat because it was drawn that way. I think when you, in the question that I think the people of Trotwood are asking, does this representative represent them? Does he have their interest in heart, especially when you vote for something like stand your ground and you don't want to wear a mask, or saying mask is not mandatory kind of thing. So their question whether their representative is actually representing them. When I had the area, it stayed in Montgomery County. They went all the way down to the end of the county when I first went there, but then they drew it back in to stay in Trotwood and Dayton and Harrison. So I think to draw the maps fairly will help the people in the African-American community, as opposed to way it's been drawn now. Their voices are not being heard, would be my perspective on this. And there could be other areas of the state that I'm not familiar with.
You know, I would just say the short answer is I think the strategy of Senator Huffman and his team who drew the maps was to, as closely as they could, adhere to the boundary issues as a defense against not even approaching the proportionality standard. So, you know, I think as you look at the map, there's certainly some strange shapes and there are some weird protrusions and so forth. Most of those are the odd shapes and natural protrusions of Ohio municipal boundaries, which themselves are not a thing of beauty. And you know, I think that's going to be the defense. And I think that, you know, it's obviously it's a half-hearted one. And I think the bottom line, you know, one of the things we heard at the Ohio Redistricting Commission meeting when they announced the map was that Senator Huffman's team hadn't produced the standards that they were following until after they had drawn the map. And I think that is one of the most telling aspects of this entire process. You know, if you didn't draw up the standards until after you had finished drawing the map, then you had no standards. And I think, you know, in his comments, I think he lauded the map's ability to hold to boundaries, but you know, that is only part of the process of drawing a fair map.
Thanks. Yeah, I think they tried to really focus on those aspects more. So we'll see what that looks like after litigation. Another question, if we reach the end of this process, we have maps for state house districts, congressional districts, done with the litigation, and people are still not happy with either the results or the process. What is kind of the next step? Could there be another ballot initiative? You know, an independent commission, something like that. Maybe Catherine.
So, you know, I don't know about you, but sometimes the first thing that I blame, the first person I think of blaming is me. And I guess what I'm trying to say here is that it's very easy to think, oh, we should have thought that they wouldn't actually follow the Constitution. Well, you know, if we're talking about doing a ballot measure, it's going to be changing the Ohio Constitution. I did not go into this thinking they weren't going to follow the Constitution. And so the next, you know, as we're thinking about the lawsuit, clearly there are different tools that we have. One is making sure that the courts hold the map makers accountable to voters and accountable to the Ohio Constitution. And then the other is to assess what happened during this process. And, you know, do we actually need to radically think about changing it? Now, one of the things that is exciting is that across the country, there are new systems in place. So our neighbors, Michigan, they have an independent redistricting commission. There are, you know, kind of new rules in places like Missouri, and there are new rules in Utah, of all places. So, you know, we can look at like what has happened across the country following this, and then make some assessments. You know, we should be thinking in really big ways about how it is that we can make our vote more meaningful. And the courts play a role, but we should also we'll do a reassessment and consider what our next steps are, because we all should be able to participate in elections that are meaningful, that are real. And the map makers should not be able to, you know, have more to say about who gets elected than the voters of Ohio.
Thanks. So we've run a little bit over, and that's my question asking. So I might have us give kind of final thoughts. One question that we are getting a lot is, what can people do? So maybe if you want to try to address that in your final thoughts. And let's start with David. We'll just go in.
What can people do? Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, the congressional maps are still being drawn. So you can reach out to your state representative and state senator and be very clear that you voted for a fair process, that you voted for a constitution, not a wish list or a birthday list. You voted for the most tangible and fundamental rule of law that we have in our system. That's number one thing that you can do. Number two, it is quite possible that the drawing of the state legislative maps is just in round one. It is quite possible that it will go to the Ohio Supreme Court, that it will have effectively be rejected by a majority of the court and come back to this very same Ohio Redistricting Commission. So, everybody out there, those folks are elected officials. And, in the case of Auditor Faber, Secretary of State LaRose, and Governor DeWine, they very definitely represent you here in Ohio. They can be told what your expectations are. And, I would operate under the expectation they're going to have another go at this. And, I think it would be very useful for them to hear what your thoughts are on it. In the big picture here, I think a ballot question is way too far down the road to contemplate. It's too depressing and disheartening. And I think Senator Huffman was almost taunting Ohioans when he said, well, if you don't like this, pass a new ballot issue. And then, he might have just added parenthetically, and then I'll try and defy that. But there's good news here. The map is not final. It hasn't yet passed the Ohio Supreme Court's hands. And I think there's at least 4 votes for a fair map on the Ohio Supreme Court. And the congressional map is still being drawn. So, be on the lookout for chicanery, but be heard, because, the only way we're getting improvements is through the voice of the Ohio people, which is ultimately what we're after in fair districts, that the voice of the Ohio's people be heard clearly.
Thanks. Tom?
Well, I just want to ditto what the professor said. The people spoke. I heard a speaker say this at the hearing. We tend to go think about the founding fathers, but the founding people spoke in 2015 and 18. We are the new founding fathers and mothers, and we spoke, and our voices need to be here. When General Assemblies don't understand the word shall, and they don't follow the Constitution, it just makes me be very disconcerted. I just fall back on something, I think it was Ben Franklin was quoted as saying after the signing of the Constitution, and he was asked, probably by a news reporter, Jessica, what do we have here? And he said, a republic if we know how to keep it. We have been working hard to keep the republic in place. We are by definition, we don't say that quite often, a constitutional Democrat republic. Constitution, Democrat, Republic. All 3 of those are critical. And we violate the Constitution, we are violating one of the major aspects of what this country is all about. So it's up to the people, we the people, to get back to the constitutional Democratic Republic. It's not over until it's over. And there's much legislation that needs to be passed. Every year is an election. And I would just encourage those who are listening to express themselves, let their voices be heard at the ballot box, and maybe contribution. Lawsuits take money. And so there may be a contribution you can give here or there, and maybe witness. Often witnesses are needed for lawsuits as well. So just think, if you think your rights have been violated, then come forward and let whoever's going to take on litigation know your thoughts. So that would be my final thought. NAACP is nonpartisan, but we do represent democracy and fairness for all people in the state and nation. So thank you for having me on the program this evening.
Thanks. And Catherine?
Well, I always suggest that people pay really good attention to what's happening at the State House. And it can be infuriating and hard work to figure out what they're up to. But that we should all be, as much as possible, participating in the hearings, going to hearings, doing what we can so that they know that we're there. I noticed that the Sue Dean Dyke had a comment, were we loud enough? And so one of the things that's worth thinking about is, for many of you who are on here and are redistricting, let's say long-term reformers and advocates of good government, I would highly encourage you all to think about taking your beautiful testimony, taking those really important words and turning them into letters to the editor, turning them into, social media posts. I think it's just, there are lots of different ways that we can get beyond a bubble. Because let's face it, we're all worried about the manipulation of district lines. And more people are thinking about gerrymandering. But it's going to take a lot to make sure that our elected officials hear us and that the general, people all over the state of Ohio understand that we deserve fair maps and that they're so closely connected to fair elections. And so, I think we're a long way since 1981 and the first redistricting reform citizen initiative. I think there's a deep understanding of gerrymandering across Ohio. But, talk to your neighbor, see what they think. I had a neighbor who came by the other day who was like, well, I don't want to get political. I was like, well, gerrymandering is political. When you're manipulated, that's political. Us asking for fair districts, not so political. And so to have those conversations with some, with any folks that are interested, and please turn that testimony into letters to the editor, because everybody deserves to have a little more information, and hearing what we really care about makes a tremendous difference. And thank you.
Great. I'm gonna kick it back to Lisa if she's still on here.
Yes, I'm here.
Great.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. It has gotten progressively darker in my room here, so I had to move positions. This has been a really wonderful conversation, and I really appreciated the opportunity to look at how the state legislative maps have been drawn. So I think that's really beneficial to know the specific area. We just had Fair Maps Day, which was our action, and stay tuned for further announcements from us. But yeah, continue sending postcards and letting people know how you feel. I think we're just going to have to keep it up. I know it's a marathon that we've got going on here. So we appreciate everybody's support, and thank you to Jessie Balmert for being our moderator tonight. And I think with that, we can close the program unless anyone has anything else to add. Great. Okay. Oh, Catherine, did you have something to add?
I just want to say thank you.
All right. Well, everyone have a lovely evening, and we'll see you on the internet.